So welcome everyone to this lovely Tuesday evening in April. I hear that there's going to be some snow up in New Hampshire tomorrow. So that's kind of a nice fun spring, I guess. I want to first just thank our Conservation and Education Committee. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Janine Maury and I chair our committee. And Michael Donahue is on our committee. I see that Mike's on the call. Paul Gianesca's on our committee. I'm not sure if Paul's on the call. I can't see him. Linda Gelder's on our committee, Heidi Bliss and Lawrence Coronis. So thank you to all of them, because without them, we couldn't pull this all together. And we are extremely fortunate tonight to have Amy Swagula from New Hampshire DES. And Amy is a limnologist who, Amy, I think it's been several years. I mean, I know that I've been at our lake for 10 years and I've pretty much known you for at least 8 of them, I think, because I've been the coordinator of our Lake Coast program. And there's often times where, we might have a aquatic specimen, a aquatic plant that we want to send over to find out, is this native, is it invasive? And you have always been extremely responsive and quick, to give us your thoughts on what it is and tell us we're safe or not. And thankfully, we haven't had any invasive plants in Stinson Lake. So thank you for always being there for us. And tonight we're going to be talking about, the aquatic plants, native aquatic plants in Stinson Lake, because there've been some lots of conversation over our last couple of member meetings about and I put in quotes, the weeds in the lake. We don't like to call them weeds because we want to call them native plants. And so we're going to learn tonight from Amy why those plants are important to the ecology of the lake and why it's so important to keep the lake healthy and clean for years to come. So thank you, Amy. I'm not going to say anything else, but we really, really are grateful for all your service to us at the lake and for tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for that intro. And I'm always happy to work with you guys. I've actually been around for a really long time now. I've been around with the state for 26 years. So it's been, yeah, quite a bit. And I think I started working with Stinson when I was back as an intern, and then early years and all the way right up through. So yeah, it's great working with you guys. I know you guys have had a lot of questions about aquatic plants, and I usually talk with you about invasive. So tonight I'm really just going to focus on the natives. And what I'd like to do, I'm just going to pop in here and just make sure everybody's on mute. All right, so hopefully you guys can still hear me. Not if you, yep, perfect, great, thank you for that. All right, so what the agenda looks like for the talk, let's see, is I'd like to just start off with an overview of aquatic plants in Stinson, and then give you an idea of what you have. And then I'll talk about your plant growth over time so that you guys have an idea of how things, at least according to our records, have changed. And then I'm sure you guys have your own observations on the lake. I'll talk about the ecology of aquatic plants, management versus non-management, and then some questions and some discussion related to that. So for a little bit of a refresher, I'm just going to show you a couple diagrams. So this first one here is showing you zonation. So when you guys think about Stinson and you're standing on shore and you're looking out into the water, you probably notice that there are some different zones of plants in the lake. And when you're close to shore, you have the plants that are rooted in the sediment, and then most of them come up above the surface of the water. Those are your emergent plants, and they're usually on shore towards like a foot or two of water. As you go out a little bit deeper, You get more into the floating leaf zone or the lily pad zone, which could be anywhere from a foot or two of water out to 5 or 6 feet, sometimes more in some water bodies. And then as you go out a little bit deeper, you get into all those different types of underwater plants that have different structures. And then once you go out deep enough, you just don't really have plants anymore because it's too deep for them to grow, and you get more into just the open water column. If you were to look at that in a picture, you have your emergent zone here close to shore. You have your lilies extending out. And then as you come out here, you start to see some of these underwater plants in the foreground, the submersed species. And then deeper out, of course, you get into that open water. So that's sort of what that zonation looks like. And most lakes in New Hampshire and most lakes in most places have all those different zones. Some of those zones are wider or narrower than others. So it just really depends on how deep the water is and what the substrate looks like in the lake. So, oops. So we're going to take a look at Stinson over time. So the Department of Environmental Services has a lake trophic survey program, and we go out and do assessments of lakes and ponds. So you guys are in the volunteer lake assessment program and collect water at the deep spot in the tributaries. For the lake trophic survey program, it's biologists that come out, and we do just in lake. We do the depth contours, we do plant surveys, we do shoreline habitat surveys, and then water chemistry just at the deep spot. So it's a bigger analysis. We do more parameters, water quality parameters for you guys than you do for VLAP, and it's more of a snapshot in time as opposed to annual monitoring. We'll do it once every 10, 20, or 30 years because we rotate only about 10 or 12 lakes a year. But because of that program, we have 3 sets of plant survey data for Stinson, and I'm going to go through those 3 sets with you now. These are all available online, and if you Google DES Lake Mapper, you would find these. And what it looks like, and I'm going to show you 3 things that all look very similar. On the left, you're going to have the outline map of Stinson, and the letters that are on that map indicate where plants are. And then the key on the right just tells you what those different plants are. So this one is from 1979, July of 1979. And you can see where the plants were distributed during our survey at that point. And you don't have a whole lot of plants listed here. And most of the plants that are listed, I'm just going to pop and let somebody in here, are all native, and they're all fairly low in abundance. So if you look over on that right-hand column on the right side, abundance is typically sparse to very abundant in our rating system. And most of yours are really low abundance, so scattered here or there. The only one that's common, and I'm going to show you pictures of all of these. The only one that's more common is pipewort, which is a really typical one that we tend to see in New Hampshire, and it's an indicator of good water quality. But all of your other plants are sparse or scattered, and your overall rating for Stinson is scattered. So moving to the next year, we have August of 1990 when we did this again. And you can see the distribution is pretty much the same to what we had previously in 1979. And again, most of your plants, there are very few of them, and they're sparse or scattered, and the overall rating is very similar here for scattered. And then this one looks a little bit different because the letters are bigger. But you can see that you did have some filling in a little bit in between. So I'll just back up here. So before, you had some little gaps on the eastern shoreline and the southeastern shoreline in the previous years. And then that just filled in a little bit as we got into this new map, which is 2002. So that is the most current map that we have. So we don't have anything more recent than that. But you can see we were at like 10 or 15 or so year gaps in between, or 20-year gaps in between data. And there were not significant changes. Even in this 2022 map, where we have more letters in different places, overall rating is still sparse for each plant and for the lake overall. So that's a good rating. And I'll talk about why you guys are sort of falling into that category and what contributes to plant growth overall as we go along. But just to take a look at some of the plants, so I took those 3 lists that I just showed you, and I took pictures of all of those different plants so that you have them as a reference. So standing on the shoreline of Stinson, looking out over the water, these are the plants that are the emergence, or they're rooted in the sediment and they come up above the surface of the water. And I'm going to go clockwise, starting from the upper left-hand corner here. So this is three-way sedge. It's a really common one that grows in shallow areas. And if you look straight down on it, it looks like it's got leaves that are at 3 angles to the stem. That's why it's called three-way stem. This is all it looks like. It's not colorful. It's just kind of greenish with brownish tips, and it tends to persist throughout the season. Moving over to the top middle, bulrush. This just has brown fuzzy seed heads on it, and it gets a little bit taller and it kind of arches out over the water. On the top right, spike rush. This one's a really low grower, but you see it sticking out of the lake bed, and it might look like it has like little brown tips or little pencil-like lead tips on it. And it just looks like grass with a little brown tip to it. The middle on the right, this one is water lobelia. This one's a little bit more colorful. These are pale purple flowers that cluster along the stem, and then they sort of nod downwards. This one it's got these little clusters of leaves down on the lake bottom, and then this one stalk comes up from it with all these little purple flowers, and each cluster of leaves on the bottom sends up one stalk. So you probably are familiar with those. Grasses, these sort of mix in with all of these around the edge. They're a little bit more nondescript, a little less colorful, but they're very common mixed in around the edges. Pipewort, this one's another one that people tend to recognize because it has this little white button-like tip on it. I call this one the astroturf of lakes because it creates sort of like that little green carpet on the lake bottom. And that little fuzzy green carpet sends up these little stalks, and then the little white button-like tips are on the top of those little stalks. So these can be really short, to a couple inches to a few inches. And in clear water, I've actually seen these get 2 or 3 feet tall. So they have a big range that they can expand in terms of height. All right, so moving over to the left a little bit here, burr reed. This one is fairly broad compared to all the rest of these. It almost looks like a cattail that didn't reach maturity. It's about a foot or so tall, and then it has these little spikes of white flowers, usually midsummer, that are really spiky. You also have a really cool plant, this one down here on the bottom left. You guys have horsetail? This one is ancient. We had this plant around when the dinosaurs were roaming the planet. So it has a really long history of persistence, and it really hasn't changed much. It's this segmented looking stalk that's straight, and then it has these little bands of brown or black around the stem all the way up. So if you see that one, that's an oldie. That's persisted for quite a long time. And then the last one on the left middle is blue flag iris. This one is fairly close to shore, and it puts up this blue purple flower, usually midsummer, with these dark green sword-like stalks or clusters of stalks of leaves that come up. So those are all of the emergents that we have on record, at least. I'm sure you have some other ones that get mixed in there, but these are some just common examples of what you guys could expect to see around Stinson. We did not have a whole lot of plants listed as floating plants in Stinson. I'm sure you guys can let me know if you found some other ones. The only one that we had listed between our 3 surveys was floating heart, which is shown here. It's a small heart-shaped leaf that has a cluster of leaves that float on the surface. You may have white water lily or yellow water lily as well. So let me know and I can certainly add those to your slideshow. But that's just the only floater that we had. Let's see. So, and then underwater plants. So these are the ones that just stay wholly underwater. We had two listed. So this top one on the right here is tape grass. And that one is, it sort of looks like a ribbon, a green ribbon, and a cluster that comes up in the water column. Then every once in a while, you may see these little weird looking corkscrew white, silly string almost looking like things coming up through the water column. And those are actually the reproductive stalks. That's the female reproductive stalk. And that rises up to the surface. And then the male reproductive part floats around and bumps into that and fertilizes it. And then more plants are made that way. But most of the time, you see these little flat, long leaves sticking up off the bottom. And then this one is kind of funny. So when biologists don't really know what something is, they come up with little funny names for them. So a lot of our records from past surveys have sterile thread-like leaf listed on them. And that's not really, I mean, it's very descriptive, but but what it really means is that it's a grassy spike rush. That's pretty nondescript. It looks like grass or hair underwater. But if you see sterile thread-like leaf, it means it's just a spike rush. So that is nothing to worry about. It's very native and probably very common. All right. Sorry, this keeps popping up. Okay. So I do want to point out algae. And I know that everyone is really hypersensitive about algae these days because we talk about cyanobacteria a lot. And we want to make sure we can tell the difference. So a lot of lakes, most lakes, almost every lake I've ever been on has filamentous green algae, which is this top photo here. And it sort of looks like a cotton candy cloud or like a cloud in the sky, and it's puffy and it holds oxygen and it billows. That one is okay. Like if you put a stick through this and you pull it up and you have all this hangy stuff off the stick, we call it the stick test. It's probably filamentous green algae. But if you have like scuzzy stuff that's forming a mat on the surface or a scum near the shoreline or it's turning the lake green a different color, then we want to know about it. And you can always report that. We have a cyanobacteria bloom form online that you can report to. But we're happy to take a look at anything that you're concerned about. So algae are plants too. They're just smaller. And we just want to make sure that you have an idea of the difference between them. So that's sort of the rundown of what we've got going on or documented in Stinson. I want to move into talking a little bit about why plants grow where they do. You can have them growing on all kinds of stuff or all kinds of places in your lake. And they really need just a few simple things, just like land plants do. They need water. Of course, they grow in water. They're almost, I guess, some of them are hydroponic, but water is a really important factor for aquatic plants. Of course, nutrients, sunlight, and for a lot of plants, substrate's necessary, but not all of our aquatic plants are rooted plants. Some of them are completely free floating. So they might need substrate, they might not. So just the basics, nothing special underwater. But when it comes to plant growth or the amount of growth, and I hear this a lot, I'm noticing more plants in this area of the lake. I didn't have these plants in front of my house last year. They're growing a little bit farther out than they used to. Um, that's for a few different reasons. Lakes are the low point in the landscape. So they are the settling basins for the landscape. So over time, they're going to fill in. And that is the process of eutrophication. And usually when we start out with lakes, and Stinson's still very much in this phase of nice and deep and clean and clear, with relatively few plants, cold water fishery, and generally lower nutrients. And then all lakes will go through a transition from oligotrophic lakes to this middle category where you start to get more plant growth, a little bit shallower. I'm going to let somebody in. You get a little bit more organics, some more nutrients over time, and then more of a transition to a warm water fishery over time. And then you get into this phase of eutrophic where you have definitely more plants, probably more algae, more organic sediment. It's a little bit shallower. And that's normal. In our lifetimes, we shouldn't notice going from one stage to the next. This should be happening over hundreds or thousands of years, except for um, we are changing our lakes quickly. And I have, in my career, noticed significant changes in our lakes just because of development pressures in the watershed. Erosion, nutrients coming in, hard packed surfaces, just funneling nutrients and sediments into the lake. So we're accelerating this rate of growth, but it is something that you can slow down by doing good watershed practices, reducing stormwater, being good watershed stewards. But the process is inevitable. Whether we're here or not, lakes will age over time and will slowly fill in. So it is something that is happening regardless of us, but it is accelerated by us. Some lakes have different basin shapes that will affect plant growth. And you guys sort of fall into this left-hand side where your shoreline bottom falls off fairly quickly in most places around Stinson. So you have sort of a deep-sided basin where you don't have a lot of shelf area for growth. So these shallow shelves close to shore are going to support more plant growth, whereas these deep-sided basins are less likely to do so. If you look at the shape over on the right, you see that this lake has a lot more shallow depth where plants can root and take over more of the shoreline area and this smaller, deeper water basin. If we translate that into some of the things that we looked at for Stinson, this is a different lake, but you can see this one gets pretty deep, 120 feet deep. It gets pretty deep pretty quickly in most places. It has a couple shallow shelves here. These are 20-foot depth contours, so it's shallow over here, but it's mostly deep. So if you were to expect what plants would look like in this lake, you'd probably have something similar to Stinson, where you have, a few shoreline areas where it's shallow, like I just showed you here, where you have plant growth, but then the deeper areas you really don't. And then in a photograph, that might look like plants close to shore here, but then you have this whole open water area of the lake that doesn't have a lot of growth. Contrast that with this lake. This is actually Powwow Pond in Kingston. You can see max depth here is 10 feet. It's very shallow. And then most of the lake is about 5 feet deep or less. So you can almost imagine what this one is going to look like. You have plants growing in most locations. And this is sort of the other end of the spectrum, where you just have a lot more plant growth across most of the water body. And then when you look at pictures of that, it looks more like this. So there are very different basins, very different bottom shapes and configurations that are going to influence how plants are growing in a lake. And this is just another shot up. This is showing you up the middle of Powwow Pond, where they definitely have a lot more plant growth across the entire lake. So just for perspective, some different lakes around the state and what they look like. So looking back at Stinson, this is your depth contours from one of the surveys that we did. These are 10-foot depth contours. And you can kind of see where your shallow zones are. And they sort of, you got one up here. You've got some shelves over here around the bottom edge. But a lot of these areas are going to coincide with where you've got tributaries coming in. And then if you look at this, is a Google Earth image. So up at your northern end, you have this shallow shelf where you have a tributary coming in, and you definitely have this little sand delta here. And then the same over here, where you can see these are the shallower areas of your lake on the bottom right. And then over on the western or the left shoreline, you have some more of these zones. So you can kind of predict where you're going to have more of your plant growth. And this sort of coincides with your plant map. Oops, I didn't pop that plant map back in there. But it gives you an idea of where you're going to have growth. And one of the things to do is when you guys are out and about walking around shore, driving around shore, See if there are any areas that you can identify where you can work to stabilize or prevent erosion from occurring and creating bigger sediment deltas, because that will help limit your plant growth if you limit these sediment deltas. Again, lakes are settling basins in the landscape, so things are going to settle in them. But if there's a road that's eroding or a culvert that's eroding that you can slow down, that can help limit plant growth over time. So those are just a couple little considerations specific to Stinson. And when it comes to aquatic plants, I always talk about realistic expectations. Lakes are not swimming pools, so they're not going to stay static over time. I mean, swimming pools take a lot of care, or else they'll be growing algae like crazy. They take cleaning, they take chlorine, they take all kinds of stuff. And lakes are not like that. They're natural systems that will evolve over time, that will be dynamic in time. So you will see change, but it should be slow change. So, what threshold, at which threshold do plants become weeds? How much is too much? Is there a rating? What do we do? So, from the state perspective, there is no threshold. It's sort of subjective. And we usually look at native plants as a beneficial function in lakes and ponds. They stabilize roots. Sorry, they stabilize shores. Their roots stabilize shores. They produce oxygen. They provide habitat. They provide food for aquatic life. So they are definitely beneficial in a lot of different ways. So we technically don't have something that says, okay, you've hit a 50% threshold, you have a plant problem. We don't have any numbers that help us define that. So we don't really have something that puts people or puts lakes into categories that would trigger management. So it's very subjective. Um, so the when, why, and how of management is usually driven by local entities as opposed to the state saying, okay, there's a plant problem. When it's an invasive species, we absolutely get involved because invasive species will grow an inch to 6 inches a day, depending on the type of plant, and will take over and it will crowd out native vegetation and become a horrific nuisance. But for natives, they tend to have the places where they can grow and will not most likely take over a lake unless you're in that shallow realm that I showed you from that southern shallow lake system. So I know that there were some questions about plant management. Should they be managed? Can we manage them on Stinson? Are we in a situation where management is necessary? And from a biologist standpoint, I don't think so. I don't think management is needed. And I kind of just ran through a lot of these reasons here. They're a natural part of the system, and we typically like to see them stay in place. They do provide a lot of those beneficial functions. One of the things that a lot of people don't think about is the consequences of plant management. And a lot of that is a balance. So, something in the lake is going to use the nutrients that are in the lake, and that's going to be either algae or plants. And if you have a balance between the two, you can maintain clear water and have some plants. But if you have a lake that doesn't have any plants or has very few plants because of management, the algae may increase and your clarity may go down because something is going to use the nutrients that are there. So it's sort of a trade off. You may have less clear water if you have fewer plants. You may have more algae if you have fewer plants. So it's sort of a little trade off there. One of the other things that I've seen is that when native plants are managed, or there's disturbance, digging, dredging, a lot of raking on the lake bed, if an invasive species is introduced, that's the first place it tends to go. It likes disturbance. So it will find that location where that habitat has been changed, and it typically settles in those locations and it takes over those areas first. So it is a habitat disturbance when you're managing natives. Just some words about fish. If you guys, for those of you who like to fish, these are the coverages that different types of fish like in lakes. I mean, you guys have a nice cold water fishery, but you do have some warm water fish in the lake. And these are the typical coverages that they like. As you get down into things like bass, they love plants. And then, of course, pike, which we don't have a lot of in New Hampshire, they absolutely love plant cover. But I mean, a lot of these can survive in a different range of thresholds of plant cover. They tend to find the plants for habitat and predator prey interactions. If you bird hunt or bird watch, they tend to like habitats that have aquatic plants, both for food sources, but nesting materials as well. So lakes that have aquatic vegetation will attract waterfowl, which is good or bad depending on what kind of waterfowl that is. If it's a lot of Canada geese, that may be a detriment because of the nutrient recycling that those birds do. Uh, and then a lot of these plants provide a lot of oxygen for our lakes. Um, the erosion control and shoreline and bottom stabilization is really important, especially close to shore where you tend to have, especially nowadays where we have so much high intensity rainfall and wind that's crashing waves on shore. These plants are really good at helping to hold the banks together and then also keep the bottom from getting all stirred up because those plants kind of protect the bottom habitat really well. A lot of the plants that are on the edges of lakes also filter water and they take up metals and nutrients that would otherwise get into the lake. And then they help bind up a lot of that sediment that's washing in so it doesn't flush into the lake too deeply. If you ever walk along the shoreline after a heavy rainstorm that dries, you may notice that there's silt all over those plants close to shore. That's them doing their job trying to hold the sediment out of the lake. So they're beneficial that way. So, what to do if you do think that management is needed for aquatic plants? Um, so permits are almost always required for any physical or mechanical removal of plants. So digging, raking, dredging, pulling, a wetlands bureau permit is needed, and you can check in with wetlands to see at what scale a permit's needed. I had Maine in here because I had done a border talk. I should have taken that out. So ignore the Maine number, but the New Hampshire number they can give you ideas on. Depending on scale and location, if a permit's needed. And for herbicide treatment, that is only done by licensed herbicide applicators under a special aquatic permit. As shorefront property owners, I'm sure many of you have had emails or pamphlets or materials mailed to you or advertised to you about buy this, put it in the lake will be clear. But those are illegal for use in New Hampshire. I mean, even as a state biologist, I can't put them in. So it has to be by a licensed herbicide applicator. Permits for that are needed. I know you guys have talked about drawdown. I'll mention that here. In the context of all the different management practices that are out there, this is sort of a rundown of them. So physical control could be by hand picking, raking, or cutting. Some of the other techniques that are out there are physical controls. There are these weed rollers that compress plants to the sediment to get them out of the water column. Benthic barriers, which are like window screens that people put down on lake bottoms to compress plants to the sediment, and drawdown. These are all techniques that would need a wetlands permit. The drawdown would need to be controlled through or regulated through or coordinated with, there we go, the DES Dam Bureau for downstream flow of water. And physical control is iffy. Hand removal by hand picking or harvesting is more effective. But when you get into things like drawdown, drawdown relies on freeze thaw action on plants. So drying out the sediments enough to freeze and dry the plant parts and the roots and the sediment. And then sometimes the ice physically scours out the plants from the sediment. And we just don't know, when is the ice coming in? When's the frost going to come in? How long is the lake level going to stay down? There are so many variables. And And I know a lot of lakes that do drawdown because of flood control purposes in the spring, so they lower 4 to 5 feet every fall. And a lot of them still have plants in the same zones that were completely exposed by drawdown, um, which signals that drawdown is sort of like an imperfect practice for management. And there have been a lot of studies on individual plants, and some plants may actually increase because of drawdown. Some may decrease, some may not be affected at all. So not all plants will respond differently. So it gets a little tricky. Mechanical cutting, this is sort of the top and the middle pictures on the right. Hydro raking and mechanical harvesting is machines that go in and physically remove vegetation from shallow areas to clear pathways. They're definitely disturbing to the lake sediment and to the habitat structure, but they can clear up bigger areas. And then I've already mentioned herbicides. Um, I'll add to herbicides that it's not a one size fits all. Plants are pretty finicky and they don't respond to the same herbicide or the same concentration of herbicide. So that really has to be dialed in by the experts that deal with those products. So it is a very specialized science when it comes to aquatic plant management. It's not just as simple as just quickly removing something. Sometimes they will grow back more if you don't manage them right. Sometimes they won't respond as well as you expect that they will. So it's sort of a rundown of what methods are out there. So this is just something from our Wetlands Bureau and something that we recommend not doing. Raking or digging all the plants out of a shorefront area. Wetlands allows for 900 square feet of area like around a beachfront or a dock that could be managed but not clear cut. And if you do remove any plants, don't leave any cut pieces in the lake because they could cause more plants to grow. A lot of plants are adapted to growing from cuttings. I already talked about the herbicides and the algicides. Of course, don't do the fence or the dredge from the lake bottom. I was out with somebody who was telling me back in the day they used to drag chain link fences on their lake bottom. And I'm like, oh gosh, please don't tell me that. This was many, many years ago before wetlands regulations. But yeah, that used to be done in the past. And then sand dumping or material deposits on the lake bottom are illegal without a permit. And sand beach replenishment can be done once every 7 years with a permit. So, and it can never be put in the water. It can just be put up on land as a beach area. Some of the simple things that you can do on your shorefront to keep plants from growing in the lake. Keep trees on your shoreline. Overhanging canopies act like umbrellas or shade over the lake edge, and it can help thin out plants in the shallows because there's not as much intense sunlight getting to the lake surface, which would then in turn cause plants to grow. So, keeping some trees on your shorefront is always a good thing. Avoiding fertilizers on your shorefront. Most of the soils in New Hampshire are acid limited. So, something like lime is more effective than fertilizer, and most, probably 75% or more of the fertilizer that people put on their lawns or on their shore frontage ends up in the lake. So it's just going to grow plants or algae. For septic systems, we recommend maintaining septic systems once every 1 to 3 years if you're on the, every year if you're on the first tier, and once every 1 to 3 years if you're a house or two back from the shore frontage, just to try to limit any nutrients from getting into the lake. And then I already mentioned taking care of erosion problems in the watershed so that you're not creating more habitat in the lake for plants to grow. You want to try to keep your lake as deep as possible for as long as possible. So that is the quick rundown of what you have in Stinson and just some of the questions that I'm commonly asked about aquatic plant management. We can certainly open it up to questions if you guys have questions. You can feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away if you like.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
Peter Hollis. My question is, how does lake pH affect all this?
So most of New Hampshire's lakes have very low pH compared to other parts of the country. We're in the mid fives to sixes. So we tend to be acidic. And that pH range that we have is not detrimental to the plant growth that we have right now. The plants are pretty adaptive to that. So our pH isn't threatening our lakes. Um, it's not causing more plant growth or less plant growth. I think if you were to drop below a 5 for a pH, in some of our lakes we're below a 5, that might get a little bit more limiting, but most of our lakes are able to sustain enough plant growth.
Okay.
I have a question about the 900 square foot allowance you had mentioned with respect to physical removal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't aware of that. That's interesting. So in a scenario where you have a small beach area, you've got some grasses or floating plants, you could physically remove them by hand up to an area of 900 square feet, or does that require a permit
So
and
I,
you're to 900 square feet?
so I
Yeah.
would double check on that because Wetlands has changed their rules recently, and I just want to make whenever anybody wants to do anything in a lake, I always say run it by the Wetlands Bureau because they're the permitters. I'm just a biologist.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they did allow for an area that you could manage. They did not say remove. A lot of times they recommend like cutting below the water surface so that you don't have, your prop getting caught up in the plants or entanglement issues at your beach. But yeah, I think that they try to recommend that you create a path out to deeper water as opposed to clear cutting your frontage.
Got it. No, that makes sense. One more question. Are you aware of a future plant census for Stinson Lake to be done, being that it's 22 years ago now?
Yeah, so I'm not. We redid our Lake Trophic Survey program in 2013, and we limited it because we only have one or two biologists that are working in that program now and about 950 lakes in the state. So what we did was we took out the lakes that were in the VLAP program or the UNH Lakes Monitoring Program, and then any lakes that weren't going to be accessible for recreation. So those are not ones that are going to be revisited. To that end, there are people in the state that do plant surveys that could be hired, consultants or just private folks that come out and do surveys like that. So you could certainly have that done. But I don't see a lake trophic survey done for Stinson at some point in the future. I don't have one on the radar.
Got it. I'm sorry, did you say that lakes that are managed by the VLOP program are not on the list, or they've been removed from the list?
Right. Yeah. So we had to narrow our focus. So lakes that were already in a monitoring program, we're having data collected on them. So what we're trying to do is advocate for the lakes that don't have anybody looking at them. So those are
Yeah.
the ones that are in the Lake Trophic Survey program.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Amy, where would we get a list of those hired professionals to do a plant survey?
I can email you a few names. So there are a couple companies out of Massachusetts that do it. And then there's a person in New Hampshire that can do it. If I have, so I'm in the process of hiring another biologist. And if we get somebody else up to speed, we may be able to do it. I just can't promise it for this summer because they need to kind of ramp up and learn some stuff before they're comfortable doing it, or in turn liberate me to come do it. So yeah, let's keep talking about that, but I can provide some short-term options that you can use.
That's great. So, in the past, you had the Weed Watchers program. Is that still in existence? Is it something like we've been trying to, maybe we want to relaunch it around Stinson, maybe call it our aquatic natives, species watch, that we could then say, okay, we already know in 2002 what we had. What do we have now? And we can almost help build our own map.
You know, that's a really interesting question, and a lot of lakes do that. So there's Weed Watchers, which looks just for invasives, but then I have a whole bunch of lakes that have their own twist on it. Some
Mhm.
do just looking at the natives and just saying, yep, they still look the same, or they update the maps annually or every 5 years. So every group has a different trajectory. But yeah, that's certainly something you can do. And I can provide you this slideshow so that you can have all the pictures so that you can update as well.
No, that would be great. And anyone who's on the call, if you're interested in volunteering to help us with that program, I mean, we'd like to be able to launch it this summer to be able to once a month do a survey of what are the plants around our lake and hopefully update that map. So, are there any other questions? I have more questions, but I'm just opening it up to others.
Amy, I'd like to ask about disturbed areas. You mentioned that very frequently plants will go to that disturbed area first. I think I recall some of the dug-in boathouses on Winnipesaukee, and they were seeing plants, especially milfoil, migrating to some of those areas right away. I think you've stopped doing that or allowing that now, but it seems to me that would be a critical issue for any sort of excavation, you might say, within the lake for the permitting bureau to consider.
Yeah, you're right. Your recollection is right on. Most of the places that we had dug in boathouses or marinas where dredges used to take place to deepen the boat slips all had areas of intense invasive species growth. So, yeah, it does foster that degree of growth. In terms of dredge, in general, it's really hard to get a dredge permit in New Hampshire. The Wetlands Bureau typically discourages dredging unless it's absolutely critical for some reason. So that's helped to slow down some of those new disturbance areas that used to occur.
I see. Well, I guess that would mean it's one of the reasons why you don't want the bottom disturbed,
Hmm.
because you would
Correct.
just encourage more plant growth and maybe the wrong kind. Now, given the bathymetry of Stinson Lake, it looks like we should concentrate on really looking at the shallow areas.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think you guys have a lot of growth or significant growth deep down because you guys get pretty deep. But if
Mhm.
you remember that picture I showed you where you could see the sediment deltas around the lake edge,
Yeah,
that's something that would be good to do to see if there's anything you can do to stabilize stream banks or stabilize culverts or stabilize dirt roads that might be eroding, because that's in your best interest in the long run to prevent nutrients from getting into Stinson. So it's sort of a double benefit.
Mm.
I didn't see my freshwater sponge that I found up there.
Those are weird, and I should have included that in there. So you guys do have freshwater sponges, and sometimes they go deep. Those actually will go deeper, and it's sometimes hard to see. But yeah, I can in the slide deck that I'll send you, I'll put some freshwater sponges
Okay,
because those are neat. I'm making a note right now.
all right, thank you.
Yeah.
So Amy, there was a slide talking about, things that would impact the growth of plants and certain things that we could do. But I just want you to reiterate, like, as we are the stewards, all of us who live in the community, we are the stewards of Stinson Lake. What would you say is the number one thing that we can do to help foster the aquatic vegetation that's beneficial to the lake, and its ecology? What's the number one thing that we should focus on? I mean, I know you just said right now, try to stabilize the banks and streams and stuff, but is there something that you would say, this is your good bang for the buck?
I think general watershed stewardship will go a long way with the lake. And if you want to keep Stinson Lake looking good for years to come, it's going to have to be watershed management, smart watershed management, because everything that happens around the lake, no matter how far back from the shore, as long as it's in your watershed, it's going to end up in Stinson Lake. So making sure that everything is stable, nutrients are kept at a minimum, fertilizer use is not done, pollutants or contaminants are not directed towards the lake. So just think about everything that you do on the land around the lake that could get there, because that's going to have an impact on what you guys see in the lake across the board: water quality, plant growth, algal growth, everything. So just be good land stewards, and that will help take care of the lake. And we do have a lot of tips that we can share with you guys. We're actually in mid-April going to be doing a webinar on nutrient reduction in the watershed, as well as a soak up the rain project, so rain gardens, and then also the Lake Smart program, where you can help to reduce erosion and other issues in your watershed and overland runoff of water getting into the lake. So I can share that information with you guys. It's part of the whole New Hampshire cyanobacteria plan. And we're trying to provide tips for groups like yours to be good land stewards in your watersheds. And then in May, we're going to talk about a webinar that's going to cover topics related to zoning overlays for things like septic systems, stormwater management, and how to enact things in watersheds to help protect watersheds even more. So we have a couple of things that are coming that I'll share with you that will help tie into all of this.
That's great. Actually, we have worked with New Hampshire Lakes a lot on the Lake Smart program, and we've been
Perfect.
trying to help educate our community about that. We've had several folks who had the free assessments of their properties and are taking action. So we're hoping to get our
Great.
first Lake Smart award this summer, hopefully. So
Good luck.
But yes, also on the cyanobacteria plan, we shared that the webinar that was held a few weeks ago, we shared it with our community, and we're going to reiterate it. So we just keep trying our best to, communicate everything that we learned from you, New Hampshire Lakes, everyone that we can learn from. So are there any more questions out there?
You guys know where to find me as well. And if you are out looking at things and you're not quite sure what they are, send me photos and I'll tell you what it is.
Yeah, you're great with that. You are so responsive. We've done that so many times, and you're like, this is what it is. Okay, So,
you guys make
thank
it
you.
easy. You send good pictures.
We try. But thank you, Amy, so much for your time and for your knowledge and sharing with us, because it's really helpful as we try our best to keep our lake healthy and clean. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'll
Thanks
send this
everybody for
recording
joining.
We
and the
appreciate it.
slides. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Amy. Bye-bye.